Welcome to our webinar. I'm Jessica Chiu from the Hong Kong Committee in Norway. This webinar is co-organized by Facebook groups Støt Hong Kong in Denmark and Netherlands in Hong Kong, for Hong Kong. It was supposed to be a one-year anniversary for the anti-extradition bill movement of Hong Kong. But then we think that the national security law for Hong Kong has been a hot topic. It's very important for us to understand it and try to understand the implication for that for even overseas people. So we are very honored to be able to have a panel with 4 members today. We have Dorian Lau from Amnesty International Hong Kong, Christopher Rønneberg, foreign news reporter for Aftenposten from Norway, Thomas Roden, chairperson of China Criticism Society of Denmark, and Ole Jonsson, foreign policy spokesperson for Liberal Youth of Sweden. And we're happy to have Håkon Jarlöf from the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And there will be a Q&A session. It will be about 5 p.m. And please try to stay for the Q&A session and write your questions on the live chat in the YouTube Live. And I'll pass now the microphone to Håkon, and we'll start this webinar now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. So I will just give a brief introduction of the national security law that we're going to talk about. And then the panelists will introduce themselves. So the national security law, I won't get into the details and the legal formulations, but there are especially 3 aspects that I see as very problematic, and many others see as very problematic, and which challenges the one country, 2 system idea. The first is this procedural issue, which is that the law is it's fixed in a way so that security laws from Beijing can bypass the Hong Kong Parliament. So it kind of establishes a channel for a law to come from Beijing that simply sidelines the Parliament of Hong Kong, or the elected legislative of Hong Kong. That's the first kind of problem with this, that it sets a precedence for how Beijing is allowed to put law into action in Hong Kong. Now, by bypassing this elected legislative, then the electoral challenge won't work as well. So protest is becoming one of the remaining ways to express yourself in Hong Kong. And that leads us to the second really problematic point about this security law, as I see it, which is that it makes protest illegal. And it does so with very vague terms, as far as I can see, with references to things called separatist, subversive, infiltrative, or destructive activities, whatever that means, or whatever actions fall under those definitions. So it will make the remaining form of freedom of expression illegal. Now, the third problematic point about this security law is that it also strips the Hong Kong government of their monopoly of violence. So Beijing will be allowed to establish what they call these security agencies inside Hong Kong. And we got some news today, I think, about a new police force being created in Hong Kong, which basically puts the monopoly of violence under the Beijing authority. And the monopoly of violence is the defining feature of a government and a state. So this really infringes on Hong Kong's independence from China and from Beijing. And these 3 things together, they sum up to something that really takes a large step forward towards dismantling the 2 systems, one country, 2 systems deal that Hong Kong has had. And to my mind, it's also very difficult to see how the end game of this is. I can see 3 possible ways out of this. One way is to simply subjugate to Beijing and let Hong Kong become just a normal part of China. The second end game I see is civil war, where there is a violent confrontation between the population of Hong Kong and Beijing. And the third way out is mass immigration or mass migration from Hong Kong, and here the British authorities comes into the picture, who has offered visa to millions of people in Hong Kong. So that is very short the three main aspects I see as problematic with this law, and why we are here to discuss it today. So we will now go over to the panelists, and I will start with Dorian Lau, which is from Amnesty International Hong Kong, and who is stationed in Hong Kong, and she will tell us a bit more about the situation right now.
Thanks a lot, Hakong. Hi, this is Dorian from Amnesty International. So I would like to talk a little bit about how Hong Kong people feel about this law, and also why Amnesty is worried about the passing of this new national security law in an international human rights perspective. So I guess for a lot of Hong Kong people, this new law, this proposed new law, came really fast. The decision to pass it came really fast. And a lot of people felt that they're not part of this. And I think Hakong also mentioned a little bit about how the law was passed by the National People's Congress. The decision to pass the law was passed by the National People's Congress in Beijing, and that it will be promulgated in Hong Kong, which means it will not go through the normal legislative process in Hong Kong. And what it means is that the Legislative Council and people in Hong Kong will not have the opportunity to engage in the usual public consultation process to basically to review this law to see if, for example, if this law is in compliance with some of the human rights safeguards now stipulated in the Basic Law of Hong Kong. And I think also that the decision to propose this law definitely also created some chilling effect. A lot of people are worried about whether they will be affected by this law, whether or not they have already broken this law. And I think that brings me to some of the worries that we have about this national security law. If we look at how the national security law is implemented in China, we find that since the law has the national security law actually has been expanded a lot in mainland China since 2015, and the definition of national security in Chinese law and actually how the law is implemented is far off from the international human rights standards. We have seen Amnesty International has documented a lot of cases of people, for example, being prosecuted for subverting state power, and when they go into court, the court would cite, for example, a screen grab of a Telegram conversation of one person chatting with an overseas NGO worker about an overseas workshop, and that was the evidence that they used. And also there were people who were charged with national security charges for example, documenting human rights defenders' work or just criticizing the government. So we can see there's good reasons for Hong Kong people to worry that the passing of this law would mean great restrictions to the existing freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly in Hong Kong.
Thank you, Dorian. We will certainly discuss these human rights infringements more. I would like to hear from you also, then, Christopher, about who works as in Aftenposten as a foreign correspondent. Is that the correct English term for it?
Well, I work for the foreign news section at Aftenposten, one of the major papers here in Norway. And I used to be the correspondent in Beijing. That was quite a few years ago, and I've been for 4 years in New York as a correspondent there as well. And I'm now based in Norway, but I went to Hong Kong quite often last year. And it was interesting to me. I was thinking about the other day, the first time I went last year was before all of this happened. It was in late April. And I was there to do a story about June 4th on the 30th anniversary of the Beijing massacre. so I met with several people. The story was basically meeting people who fled Beijing for Hong Kong and who were now living in Hong Kong because that was seen as a free space for them. And their thoughts on being so close to China but so far away, and several of them aren't allowed to go back even. And it's a paradox then to see now that the people are talking about fleeing Hong Kong because it's no longer safe. And the change over that year has just been astounding. There are several things to say about press freedom in Hong Kong right now and how it's under pressure, why that means something, and I'm sure we can go into the details later. But this has been happening over time. I think 10 years ago, Hong Kong was around 18 or so on Reporters Without Borders list of press freedom in the world. Last year, it was 80th. So it's fallen very quickly and very hard right now. And you can feel that when you talk to local journalists in Hong Kong, which I've done quite a lot of. It's one thing is the physical risk that they're that they have to become used to when they cover the demonstrations. If you go out and cover these demonstrations in the streets of Hong Kong, not as much now because there are fewer of them and fewer confrontations, but very much toward the end of last year, you're at risk as a journalist in the streets covering these demonstrations because you know that the police might target you, even if they see your press badge and your equipment, and maybe because of it. So there's a clear physical risk. There's also the risk of being punished for what you write. That's been happening over time as well. Obviously, this new law will make that much more dangerous. Take, for instance, if you want to write a story about the increasing demand for Hong Kong independence, which was usually a taboo subject in Hong Kong up until very recently, really up until the passing of this law. If you, as a journalist in Hong Kong, want to cover that, you have to be very careful, and most likely you can't do it. Maybe if you're in the Hong Kong Free Press. South China Morning Post, they're holding on as well as they can, but even there, they're going to face a lot of difficulties going forward. And then there's the question of foreign journalists in Hong Kong. I know a lot about visa troubles to the People's Republic of China. I've been dealing with that for a number of years. I can imagine very easily that might extend to Hong Kong quite quickly. That it's going to be more difficult for foreign journalists to cover Hong Kong from the ground, both the journalists who live there and serve there as correspondents, or people like me who visit from time, well, frequently lately, but who fly in from abroad. And that's obviously going to be a problem for that sort of goes into the wider list of democratic problems in Hong Kong. If there aren't people on the ground covering what's happening, covering the police violence, covering what's happening in LegCo, what's happening to people's rights to speak out freely, then obviously it's going to be easier for the government to limit those freedoms. And finally, I just want to make a general point that one of the consequences of all of this isn't necessarily the physical or other barriers that are put on journalists. It also extends to self-censorship, both among journalists and among the people that journalists talk to. I noticed that very clearly last year, over the course of my three main visits to Hong Kong last year, that people became more and more afraid of talking to me. And if I wanted them to be open, I usually needed someone to go in between who could vouch for me and say that it was safe to talk to me. Otherwise, people who didn't know who I was would be very cautious and afraid that whatever they said might come back and haunt them. And the more self-censorship you have, obviously, that's going to be a democratic problem as well. So I'll just leave that there for now as some sort of main talking points.
Yes, thank you. One of the other things we want to get into in this webinar is what should be the European response, and we have two panelists from European politics here. I'll start with you, Thomas Rodén, who is you're from the China Criticism Society of Denmark, which, as I understand, is a network of mostly politicians, youth politicians in Denmark.
Yeah, that's right. It's like a network with the people from both sides of the island, Denmark, talking about the Chinese issues and also working to change the politics that are made in Denmark so we get more China critical, because we are a small country, but we have big hands, and right now they're in China's pockets very much. I visited Hong Kong myself in November 2019 on the election, and the interpretation that I got was that Hong Kong is maybe the most progressive democratic movement the world has seen in this century. And I think that what I saw on the ground, what I heard from the people was that lots of young people look like me. They are very democratic. They have a big heart for the juridical system that should work in the right manner. But they have a big problem because on the other side they have the Chinese government always trying to get more and more Chinese influence into Hong Kong. And I think that you don't need to be an expert on foreign politics to see that what China wants and what is in their interest is not to make sure that you have freedom. It's not to make sure that you have a good system of law. It's quite the opposite. And therefore, I must say that I don't see this law coming as maybe a big shock, because at some point, I think we all know that China is always trying to get more and more saying in Hong Kong, and that also means that the two systems is under a very heavy pressure from China all the time. And you can say now, okay, so what do we do about this? And that's a hard question. I think the reason China is going into Hong Kong in this manner is because they want to. It's an advantage for them to have more control over Hong Kong. So we need to make sure that this advantage to go into Hong Kong will be also a bigger disadvantage on their foreign policy. And that's not easy because, for example, you take the European Union. They have also been working in the European Union with buying harbors, so on. For example, in Greece, where they now own the biggest harbor, which means that Greece, they doesn't want to do anything about China, and they doesn't want to provoke them because they own the biggest harbor, and they don't want China to shut down their economy. And that's a very, very big problem. But we have with us here today some people from the north, from Denmark, and all from Sweden. And I think that what we also should be talking about is how can we make new arrangements, political arrangement inside the European Union, where we can work around these countries, as Greece, for example, also Italy in some way. So I would propose that, for example, the Nordic countries stood more close together and worked on a united politics towards China, because it's very, very hard for a small country to stand up against China. We have seen it in Norway that suddenly, because a wrong guy got the Nobel Peace Prize, they couldn't even sell their salmon to China anymore. We saw it in Denmark that after our former prime minister had a meeting with Dalai Lama, we couldn't sell our pig to China anymore. And that's how it goes on. So we need to stick together, because if we do that, we have a more saying. And this will also lead me into another thing that what we see right now, I think, is that the United States is actually for once doing something good in foreign policy, and that's putting some pressure on China. And I think that the British are also in their way. The Australians are doing something, and the biggest goal right now must be to get more and more and more countries to join this. And I think that the only way we can win this is by sanctioning China if they do so, and if they do so. So we need to put up red lines for them, just in the same way as China does to all other countries. We know that there is a red line saying that Taiwan, for example, is not a part of China. So nobody dares to say that, even though it's obvious to everybody that it isn't. And I think in the same way, we need to put some red lines in front of China. And this is really not easy. But the problem right now is that in lots of European countries, our leaders, they don't even try, because they are more involved in getting money out of China and getting allowed to sell even more of their things to China than they are in making sure that the world order we have in the future, our world order that we can live with, because it's also in Denmark's own interest and it's in Europe's own interest that we have a Hong Kong with democracy, with capitalism, and so on.
I return to the calmer union to stand up against the Chinese. All right,
Yeah,
so
of course.
and so our last panelist is Olle Jonsson from the English word is the Liberal Youth of Sweden. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. And as you said, I'm the international spokesperson for the Liberal Youth of Sweden. And we have been following the Hong Kong issue for both since 2014. We had our first contacts, but now much more closely since 2019 and the protest against this extradition bill. So what we did first in Sweden was that we had a lot of protests outside the embassies of China to highlight the issue of this extradition bill. So we did that. It was very interesting to actually see the Chinese response, because this was also the beginning of China's more aggressive foreign policy against Sweden. So in Sweden, they are using the embassy web page to answer all the protests. So for them, it was a harassment what we did when we sat outside their embassy with yellow umbrellas. And they said that we did that in citation mark freedom of speech. So we had these protests, and together with Thomas, we also participated in the electoral observation mission to Hong Kong last year. It was very interesting to follow the district's elections, and it was actually quite hopeful during the election nights, because we were outside one of where they counted the votes. This was at a location where they suspected fraud, so it was a lot of people outside. So when we were waiting for this issue to get sorted out outside this place, we got the results, and you could see like how in each district it was a pro-democracy candidate who was winning. So it was actually very optimistic during that election night to see the very big support for the pro-democracy movement that night. But of course, then the corona came, and with the introduction of this new security law, it's very depressing actually to follow the news from Hong Kong. We are extremely worried about the state of the democracy in Hong Kong right now. Thomas started to speak a little bit about what international action could be. I think we will evolve into a broader discussion there. But of course, for Sweden, as a very small country, we are very weak if we were to act alone. So if we will have any chance of actually influencing China, we have to go through the European Union. And then it would be very good to see Norway also joining the European Union, so you could take part in this this struggle. But so far, of course, it has been very depressing to see the action from the European Union, because they have been too slow, too silent, and so far really disappointing. Of course, they are having these statements that it's very worrying about what's happening in Hong Kong right now, but we need to see some actual action from the European Union. I think in the 29th of May, they had a web seminar with all the foreign ministers of the European Union, where they discussed like which actions they should take against Hong Kong and to support Hong Kong. And I think it was only Sweden that actually lifted the possibilities of actually using sanctions against China. And I'm very positive of using sanction. I would very much like to see a Magnitsky-style sanction on the European level. But speaking of experience of the European Union, those sanctions regimes, it takes a lot of time before they get into place. But it's very obvious that the European Union should do something. Right now, USA is doing much more, and we're also seeing actions from Canada, Australia, and UK. And it's very vital that the European Union joins into that, because otherwise the European Union will only be considered to put interests above values, and I think that would be very sad for a union that says at least that they value human rights very high. Yes.
Thank you, Olle. I think we had a good taste of everything that this webinar will include. I'll just give a quick update on for those viewers who don't know what the extradition bill was. That's 1 year ago, there was an extradition bill introduced where people of Hong Kong could be put in jail, basically in Beijing or in mainland China. And this is what created the huge wave of protests that has now been going on for almost a year. It toned down a bit during the corona situation, but with this new security law, as I understand, the protests have re-emerged to its full strength. All right, so one of the very obvious possible implications of this new security law is to ban different freedom of speech, and not least also organizations like Amnesty International, who are there to report from what is happening. So I would like to hear from you first, Dorian. Is this something Amnesty International is currently afraid of?
Yeah, I think not just Amnesty International, but the wider civil society is worried about the implication of this proposed law on the right of different groups to be it making recommendations to the government, criticizing the government, or just exposing certain information. So I think one particular area that's worrying is that although there isn't a lot of details about this law, but one of the areas set out in the decision to pass this law is that Hong Kong, all the foreign intervention or foreign forces will be banned. But foreign forces is actually an extremely broad provision. And if you look at Basic Law Article 23, it's actually even broader than the provision set out in Article 23, because in Article 23, it says very clearly that only political organization that has a connection with foreign countries would be banned or would be regulated by the law. However, right now the decision only sets out foreign forces, but who really is a foreign force? So, and if we look at how China enforces law, we can see that there were some very worrying example. For example, human rights lawyer Wang Quanzhang was sentenced to jail for subverting state power because he was actually working with a foreigner on running an NGO in China. So there really isn't a clear definition right now, at least from what we've seen, on what really means by foreign forces, and also what action constitute the breaking of this law. And that's why a lot of groups, including us and a lot of INGOs, international NGOs, are also worried about being a foreign forces and what it means to us, having when we actually have operation in Hong Kong.
You wanted to add to this, Christopher?
Yeah, I just want to add to that because I think it touches upon an important point, that one of the problems with this new law is that it's so vague that it could contain anything. And that's the same way the government operates in mainland China, that you don't always know when you cross the line. And as long as you don't know where the line is, you restrict yourself in a different way than what you would otherwise do. I just was reminded of an example when it comes to press freedom, how those moving lines or how those unknown lines can work. In Myanmar, back in the days of the junta, before they had their democratic election in 2015, I was there and I visited a newspaper. It's called the Myanmar Times, and they showed me how they were censored. And I found this photograph. I don't know if we can see it here on the screen, but it's a photograph I took of one of the pages that they had in return from the government. So they sent their pages. It was crossed out whatever they weren't allowed to write with a big red pen, and they had to redo it to accommodate the censorship government. And as long as they did that, they could publish their paper. Easy, because then you could always try out to sort of cross that line, and if it was sent in return, then you couldn't do it. But if something slipped through, then it wasn't your fault, because it just meant that the censorship hadn't, or that the government hadn't caught it. But with lines that aren't clear, and with the law that doesn't really tell you what's allowed and what's not allowed, it's much more difficult for organizations like Amnesty or journalists or anyone else who want to operate in a free society to do so.
But can I ask you, Christopher, would it be so? Would you reconsider going to Hong Kong as a reporter now, or would you still do that without being afraid?
Right now, I would go. But it's they still haven't opened their borders for non-residents. So because of the corona situation, I'm unable to go. But it would certainly be a factor in my planning going forward. Also because, as I mentioned, I've had some issues with getting a working visa to the People's Republic of China. And it would be something that I would have to take into consideration. And that's obviously, it's much more difficult to do a proper job writing about Hong Kong affairs if you aren't able to go there. So I'm hoping that I can go back soon.
So to ask the same question to you, Dorian, has there been any consideration of relocating the office working for Hong Kong, or is that not an option at all?
I think for the operation of Amnesty International, actually not only in Hong Kong, we do have some offices in places where the government also has rather strong control over the civil society. So I think in general, we have also started the conversation of just in general risk mitigation, and like Christopher said, when it's the chilling effect, right? Like when you know that you can be a foreign force. So when you say certain things, you keep asking yourself, am I saying something like that crosses the line? So I think it's apart from thinking about the operation and also how to mitigate risk, it's also about day-to-day work, how we like when you say certain things, how you try not to self-censor. So I think this is a lot of stress, not just to Amnesty International, but I would say to a lot of civil society organizations. Yeah.
So could you also, is it possible to elaborate something on how you work in Hong Kong, how Amnesty International works with the protests? Is that, I'm not sure what details you can tell us.
So in general, Amnesty International does have a section in Hong Kong. We have human rights education programs. We do fundraising in Hong Kong, and we of course do advocacy work. And I think in Hong Kong, we actually are not. I would say we are not the most well-known organizations in Hong Kong. Before the protests, I'm not saying we are right now. I'm just saying that in the past, right now we also focus on a lot of different areas of human rights. For example, LGBTI rights, rights of asylum seekers and refugees, and also rights of migrant domestic workers. But I think during the protest, we really pulled out a lot of resources into looking at how police assembly, because this is one of our focus area. So during the protest, we did observe on site and also through verified videos to look at how police deploy officers, and also whether or not the way the police assembly actually are in compliance of international human rights law. Other than that, we also talk to different people. So we do research not just by looking at how police deploy officers and the tactics that they use. We talk to, for example, doctors, civil society organizations, and protesters and first aiders on site to understand what really happened. and most importantly, how the entire protest, how the overall response by the government, not just on the protest side, but for example, the prosecution or the use of different charges would affect the civil society. So for example, right now we see those who got into because on 1st of July last year, as we all know, a group of protesters went inside the Legislative Council, and they were initially charged with trespassing going into the Legislative Council, but recently they are charged with rioting, which is a very way serious charge, facing a way heftier sentence. And I think it's also brought light to the vagueness of the laws, because it's not just like national security law. Of course, the proposed law is pretty bad, but if you look at the laws we have right now, for example, the Public Order Ordinance or the Sedition law, and even the Terrorism Act as terrorism law, all of them have pretty fake charges, and we now see them in effect in action when we see the government using them to prosecute protesters.
We know, so one reason I'm asking about this as well is that we know that when journalists and organizations leave these areas, things can turn worse. Then there's much more room for governments to repress the citizens. So, but this is a very tricky situation both for journalists and NGOs, of course. So they would need a helping hand. That's where we have the European responses again, right? So would it be, so let's in order to allow journalists and NGOs to take the risk on writing critical articles or doing critical reports, would it be an option for European Parliament, for the Swedes, for example, Olle, to have a channel with the opposition in Hong Kong and promise them visas, so in lack of a better word, when shit hits the fan, they could escape to Sweden?
Yes, I think in the first step, I think hopefully they won't have to escape from Hong Kong. I think even before that, we can support the pro-democracy movement, and if it's about the journalists, we already have like financial support for journalists, perhaps not in Hong Kong, but we have some other programs in other countries where journalists are suppressed. Then we have some foreign aid that we are channeling to people that we believe are important for the democracy, because they are, for instance, upholding the freedom of expression. But yes, when it comes to asylum, I think it's not only for journalists, but I think we should be quite generous when it comes to political asylums for people that are in danger because they have taken side in Hong Kong. We will see if it comes to that. As Thomas mentioned before, Great Britain, of course, they have a historical connection to Hong Kong, have already offered these visas, but I think it would be a very good signal from the European Union. It would not be from the European Union, but the member states, because this is a member state issue. So from the member states that they would offer asylum, I think that would be a very good idea. And we will see if that happens. But I think countries that would like to actually take a stance against China, I think that would be a very good way actually to show support for the democracy movement, to actually allow, for instance, journalists to work from Europe. But as I said before, that would be a very late step, that people would actually have to escape from Hong Kong. And I'm really hoping that that would not be the case, because it's so different for a journalist to report like from the distance compared to actually be on the ground. So let's hope that won't be necessary. But if it's necessary, I do really hope that the member states of the European Union step up and actually offer this kind of asylum.
Thank you. So this we're getting a segue now into one of our next topics. So you mentioned Thomas, investments made by China in Europe. Do you think there are any immediate implications for Europe after this security law?
Implications in the way of Chinese involvement in Europe, or the other way around? I just need to understand the question, I think.
Yeah, so implications for Europeans from this Chinese security law, or for the European foreign policies.
Of course, there will be some for Europeans, but I don't think that's the most important thing in this case. I think that the problem right now, for example, is if you see the situation in Denmark, we have a foreign minister who is still talking about that we need to have dialogue between Hong Kongers and the CCP. But you know, on the one side we have a democratic movement who are totally unarmed, and on the other side we have a communistic superpower with atomical weapons, and they are suppressing the other side all the time. Then you can't start to talk about dialogue, because you don't have equal dialogue, and the dialogue will never be equal. So I think that's the problem right now, is that in Europe we haven't made sure that to put some red lines in front of China. So we make sure that we can actually say what we want to say, because I'm sure that if you had a drink with the foreign minister in Denmark and asked him about Hong Kong, he would be in no doubt, because he's a Democrat as well. Of course, there would be no doubt in his heart where he stands, but he doesn't dare to, because he don't want to be enemies with China. So I think that in order to help Hong Kong, Europe also first needs to start helping themselves and make sure that not only the freedom of speech for the European people are preserved, but also for the politicians themselves. Because the problem is that when we first go into government, you will self-censor yourself. And you see that all the time. Also, I think that one of the biggest problems for Hong Kong and for them to gain support all over the world is that government leaders doesn't dare to say what is actually happening. So they talk about it in terms that are absurd. For example, when you talk about that you need to have no violence in Hong Kong, and you need to sit down and have a nice chat with Mr. Xi Jinping. He is a dictator, and he is the world champion in human executions the last many years. So that's not how that works. And if I can bring a small note to the thing Ola said about getting these Hong Kongers to seek asylum in, for example, in Sweden and Denmark, because that's also a thing about politics. I don't think that the most important thing for Denmark and Sweden to do is to make sure that Hong Kongers can get asylum, because I think most of them will want to go to Taiwan, UK, America, Australia, and so on. I don't think we are that attractive to Hong Kongers, even though we are great countries, but we have very different language and so on. So I don't think that's where we should put the most of our energy. But when that's said, I think it's very, very important that some countries go into that direction, because maybe this law won't perceive that we will have a need of a lot of people getting asylum out of Hong Kong. But I think at one point, maybe not now, maybe not in 5 years, but then in 10 years, there will be a need, because China is tightening their grip around Hong Kong, and I don't think it's going to stop in the coming years.
Yes, Ola.
Yes, and just to reflect a bit more on your question on like how this could actually affect like Europeans in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has for a very long time been this port of freedom, or how you could say, like during the years China was closed. I mean, Hong Kong was actually the gateway to China, because it was still rather open. And even after, like when China joined the WTO during the early 2000s, Hong Kong remained still had this important position, because it was still considered something else than China, and it was rather free. Now, when you are imposing this one country, one system model on Hong Kong, of course, that will change. And a lot of companies and a lot of people that have gone to Hong Kong just because they have this special system, because it is not China, or at least not have the Chinese model. Of course, a lot of people who have the business or are in Hong Kong of different reasons, work there or study there, they will probably go somewhere else, because Hong Kong, they are no different from the rest of China anymore. So of course that will perhaps be a very sad effect for Hong Kong, because they will perhaps lose out of a lot of people that actually has come to Hong Kong and actually shaped Hong Kong for the past years. And that is not only Europeans, and it's of course affecting all of the other international people that are in Hong Kong right now.
Dorian, you wanted to say also something about this?
Yeah, sorry, just really quickly. I just want to point out also how it will affect people like Hong Kongers who are living and working in Hong Kong, because what we see right now is only, although it's only a proposal to pass a national security law, but the broader meaning of this is a development of a national security framework, which if we look at the development of such a framework in mainland China, it became almost an all-encompassing structure that can potentially trump some of the human rights safeguards in Hong Kong. For example, in China right now, there's a cybersecurity law. There are requirements for example, for internet companies to give up personal information of their clients, or for data storage company to be scrutinized by the government because of national security reasons. And even for the criminal procedure law in China, we can also see that there are actually a special mechanism of detention for people who allegedly violate national security law. So I think this passing of this law is very dangerous, because it opens a floodgate of, or I should say, it can potentially start the building of this framework that can potentially threaten some of the existing human rights safeguards that Hong Kong has.
Yes, I lived for a while in Taiwan, and one of the places you all mention is that people might want to go to Taiwan, but in Taiwan, everyone looks to Hong Kong to see what they might be facing when China turns their gaze towards Taiwan. And this whole, as you're talking about now, Dorian, the way China is doing international data security, the way they are doing business, the Battle of Hong Kong isn't just about, or to what extent is the Battle of Hong Kong just about Hong Kong, and to what extent is it about a global order governed by China that needs to be reacted to now? I guess that goes to maybe you, Christopher, talking to politicians on this. To what extent are they thinking about this?
Well, I think many politicians, at least in Norway that I know, and from what I can tell other places, see this security law in Hong Kong as a watershed moment. Not just because it shows how confident China is right now, that they're seizing this opportunity in the corona crisis. We also, of course, noticed that at this annual meeting at the two sessions in Beijing, they left out the peaceful part of the peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and we see troops gathering on the border towards India. We see a very confident, quite aggressive behavior from China. But I think what happened with this law is that it was seen as a breach of an international agreement with Great Britain, an agreement that had an international stamp of approval. And the fact that China could break it so easily, of course, will lead to a lot of companies in Hong Kong and other places saying, well, okay, if they can breach that agreement, what good is it for us to sign an agreement with China right now if it's only valid for as long as they want it to be valid? So I think it's illustrative of the moment we're in. I think it showcases that China feels it's strong enough to break down some of the goodwill that they've built up over the years, and maybe that they're hoping that the short-sightedness of a lot of companies who see profit first and everything else second, that's stronger than anything else. It's a gamble on their part as well, and who knows how that might play out.
Yes, Thomas, you also wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, agreeing very much on that. I think that China's look at themselves has changed a lot in the past years, maybe since the financial crisis, because you see how they are getting more and more and more involved in the Chinese Sea and the Kashmir region, there towards Taiwan and Hong Kong, and I think this is just a small piece of that puzzle. But on the other hand, I think that it's a very big problem that this confidence now is also going in to the multilateral relationships with the whole world. You see them right now in the coronavirus, how they have really influenced the WHO, and I think that you will see China get more and more influence in all these different assemblies, because that US is pulling out more and more, and therefore our answer to stop this Chinese aggression on our multilateral international work is also that Europe and the US stand together in these institutions and work harder on making sure that China can gain as much influence as they, for example, did in the WHO, where the organization now has become like a Chinese spokesperson.
We are. This is a nice segue over to our next topic. So you mentioned the U.S. and Europe standing together in this, but we are also having a U.S. that seems to be having more than enough with itself these years, and the politics there might be changing their foreign policies. It's difficult to predict what will happen in the U.S. So let's assume that we cannot rely on a stable foreign policy from the US, and we still face a confident China. What tools do we have in Europe to deal with this? Maybe Olle can answer this.
Yes, as I said in the beginning of this, of course, individual countries in Europe, it's very difficult for them to actually do something. But when you gather all these countries in the European Union that we actually have, we become one of the world's biggest markets. And that is, of course, also interesting for China, because they want a piece of that market. That's a lot of money we're talking about. But the problem for the European Union is that when it comes to foreign policy, you need to agree. Everyone needs to agree. So the foreign policy never becomes stronger than the weakest policy of one country. So let's say, for instance, that Greece, which have sold their ports to China, the Piraeus port, they haven't been very happy to criticize China on any human rights matter for the past years. And that is a real problem for the European Union right now. I think what the EU would need to do in a first step, they have discussed, Josep Borrell, the spokesperson of the Commissioner on External Affairs, they have started to elaborate on how they can actually make a few exceptions from this, that they have to be that all the member countries has to agree, and that on issues like human rights. And I think that would be a good start, that you don't need all the membership countries to agree, because otherwise the statements and the actions from the European Union would be very weak. And when it comes to sanctions, I personally believe that Magnitsky-style sanction is the best tool to use here. USA have developed their set of Magnitsky sanction. In that way, you can freeze assets, you can impose visa bans on individuals that are responsible for instance, human rights abuses. And I think that would be very good if the European Union could get in place, and if we could coordinate that with the USA, UK, which has also these sanctions. That would be a very, very strong signal to China. But so far, big countries in the European Union like Germany and France, but especially Germany, which has been very reluctant to actually take a stance when it comes to China, needs to do something quite soon, because otherwise nothing will happen from the European side, and that would be a huge disappointment for the European Union.
And with Magnitsky-style sanctions, you mean target individuals in the Chinese repressive apparatus, right?
Yes, but also, of course, in the Hong Kong SAR administration, there is people that you could actually target those sanctions at. Yes.
So yes, Thomas, I also wanted, because this sounds like you wanted to comment on this, but this also sounds like where your Kalmar Union solution comes in.
Yeah, because I agree with Holland, and I myself love the European Union, but I don't have so much trust in their foreign policy. So I also believe that this is a good way to work, but I think we need to do other things. For example, you can see that the so-called Five Eyes Alliance, I think they call it, with the English-speaking country, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, sticking together. I think that a cooperation like that could be worth talking about with some European Union members joining, for example, Germany, France, the Nordic country. But I think we need to do it in groups because it's so easy to target, especially the small country when they go on their own. But the problem in this manner in our talking now, we were talking about if we can't rely on the US. I think that in order to keep China down, we can always rely on the US because this is about their own homogeny. So that won't be a problem. I'm not so afraid of that. I think the problem is that they can sell out their belief in freedom for economic gains. For example, how are they willing to give up Hong Kong if China says, okay, we can buy some more soybeans from you? Are they willing to give up the protection of Taiwan if they say, okay, we will buy more American cars? So I think that's the very dangerous thing, because the US won't give up on China, but maybe they'll give up on freedom in China.
Christopher, you wanted to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion. I also think what we're seeing now is a geopolitical earthquake, and the EU, whether it wants to or not, is going to have to choose at some point which side they want to be on. They've been trying now for some time to buy cheap stuff from China and to keep their security guarantees from the US. That's not going to be a viable solution in the future. We see the US already threatening to pull out soldiers from Germany. That's going to continue because this path that they're on, I don't think it has that much to do with Donald Trump. We saw it under Obama as well. They tried to form the TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade union between the US and other Pacific nations, not including China, as a way to keep China down. No matter what happens in November in the US, this pressure against China, it's absolutely bipartisan, and it's going to continue. And countries in the rest of the world will have to choose. And that's, I think we see signs of that happening already in Europe, that they're understanding, not just because of the pressure from the US, but also that the policy against China since the early 70s has failed. There's been this, I mean, it's a big discussion topic in all China circles for the past couple of years, that there's this realization now that the attempt to engage with China to enable change from the ground up, training human rights lawyers and all of that, in the hope that China at one point would start respecting their own constitution and becoming more democratic, more liberal, that's not panning out, especially not since Xi Jinping became party leader in 2012. It's become more authoritarian, less democratic, and it's pushing its ideology on the rest of the world. So I think there's going to be a point of reckoning soon for also the European countries. And I don't think for many of us it's going to be difficult when that time comes to choose. And I think, and I know we're going to talk about this parliamentarian or the parliamentary alliance between several nations. I think that's a sign that this is already happening.
Yes, Christopher has already alerted me that we should buy Aftenposten tomorrow to read a lot about this inter-parliamentary group that has formed among democratic countries, where parliamentarians from different countries have allied in an inter-parliamentary group. You wanted to say something on this, Thomas?
Yes, just a small comment, but I agree with Christopher that Europe needs to choose, and I think the first place where we will see this will be on the 5G net, because it's in the greatest interest of the United States, and I also think that it's in Europe's own interest, because the best developer of the 5G that is not far away is actually a European-based country. It's in Sweden, the Ericsson company. So I believe that the 5G will be the first place where we will see this step where the United States will say, even you're with us or you're against us. And I sincerely hope that the European Union and the European countries will answer that we are with the United States in that manner.
We have to open up for the Q&A soon, but Christopher, would you just give us the teaser of this inter-parliamentary group and what you think it can come out of it?
Well, it was formed, or at least announced, Friday, a week ago, and it's 11 nations, including the US and Great Britain, Australia, Japan. The EU is there, and as well as Norway and Sweden, notably not Denmark. But there are parliamentarians and often leading political positions. In Norway, for example, it's the leader of the Liberal Party, one of the parties in the government coalition, as well as the number 2 in the Foreign Relations Committee in the Norwegian Parliament. In the US, it's Marco Rubio and Bob Menendez, and people can draw different conclusions from that. But it's a clear attempt to move beyond this problem that we've seen, where China, as they say in the Chinese saying, they kill the chickens to scare the monkeys. So they'll go after the small nations like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, as they have done in turn. First Denmark with Dalai Lama, then Norway with the Peace Prize, and now Sweden over this award from the PEN organization to Gui Minhai. So they go after them individually, and they know that small nations will have difficulties saying anything against China in those matters. So they'll often give in and maybe receive a panda in return. So in forming this group, I think they're hoping to have an arena where they can share experiences, and where it's also possible for them to come to each other's defense when one nation is attacked, the way especially Sweden has been now for the past year. Of course, there are limitations to this. Only 11 nations and the EU, only Western democracies, in addition to Japan, are represented. A big chunk of the world isn't represented, so there are limits there. But at least I think it's a very important step in this big geopolitical shift that I believe that we're seeing right now.
All right, thank you. We have several questions, so I will start doing the Q&A now. We have a first one question for you, Dorian, about what the people of Hong Kong. What's your temperature of the people of Hong Kong? What they think about what is called trade and Lam Chao Burnism at this stage.
Yeah, I think I saw in the comments also someone cited the Citizen Conference survey that 79.2% of people still support Lam Chao, and I think the first question actually asked about people who voted in the district council election, and I must say the developments after the district council election I think increased the sense of hopelessness of a lot of people, because it was actually a landslide win. But right now we can see is that it became a norm for district councillors to sit on the floor to have meetings, not because of COVID and so that they are not opening venues, but because some of the government officials actually refused to give to provide venues because the meetings were were designed to discuss something related to human rights or to election, or even just by looking at police use of force in certain district. And I would say the sense of anger is definitely there, and that people feel more and more frustrated because we can also see, I would say, the inconsistent application of the public health measures. So right now, people can go to theme parks, people can go to book fairs, people can go to karaoke, and schools are open, but they cannot protest. So all the peaceful assemblies are banned. So I would say people still try, because there were applications for they still try to get a letter of no objection from the police to do public processions. But it seems like the channels to peacefully and publicly channel their opinion became like it's just harder and harder for them to do so.
There's also a question here. If anyone feels like they can answer this, but why? So why would China go through this costly process of these demonstrations, and why didn't they just wait until 2049, or at least wait like 10 years? Just the end game is in their ballpark, anyways, isn't it? Anyone feels like they have an answer to this?
I don't know if I have the answer, but I can give it a shot. I think that the problem for China is that if they leave Hong Kong untouched until 2075, then what population will be in Hong Kong? Because if you have education systems that are free, if you have press that are free, and the people that are free, in so many years, developing thoughts that go in direction of a liberal democracy, then they will have a much bigger problem getting these people into China in 2047. So I think that's why they need to sit tight in Hong Kong and hold them tight to China, is because if they lose their grip on Hong Kong, I think they're afraid it will slip away, not in a geographic way, but maybe more in mind of the Hong Kong people. And you see that also today, because a lot of people in Hong Kong don't see themselves as Chinese, and that's a very big problem, because then they don't have a national state, then they just have a state.
Christopher, you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I think another factor is also that they saw this as a challenge to their authority, which it obviously is. And even though there's a big firewall of information coming into China, or in front of all of information coming into China, there is information coming in. People can see that there are demonstrations going on in Hong Kong, and there's obviously some kind of risk of that spreading into mainland China, especially in a weak economy, because the main deal between the government and the people in China is that people will become more wealthy, and they will be less prone to complain about their political system. So I think they felt that they had to do something. Last year, there was a lot of talk about them sending in troops. That would have been a mistake, because it would have been much more difficult for the rest of the world to ignore that. So I think they see this law as a way of getting control and stifling the demonstrations, and as I said, maybe not risking as much. Maybe or at least some of the Western companies that are there will think that, okay, maybe things are more stable now that there are fewer demonstrations in the streets, and they might stay put in Hong Kong as long as they don't feel that they themselves are at risk. So it might have been an opportune time for China to do it right now, especially with the rest of the world being distracted by the corona crisis.
We have several questions actually about the Magnitsky Act, and especially what you think it can achieve. So this is almost like a vote. Will it work or will it not with the Magnitsky Act? Ole, you mentioned them. Do you probably don't foresee is that the only solution, but you think it can be quite effective?
I actually spoke with with Cecilia Malmström, who was the former trade commissioner, and she is living in Gothenburg about this. She do believe that it's absolutely a possibility to try going that way, because it would be very significant for those who are actually affected by this sanction, and it's a very, very clear signal if you actually manage to first actually get this sanction regime in place and then actually use it on people, because then you have really drawn a line on what the European Union, for instance, is able to do. But if it will work in the end, of course, it's very difficult when you're using these geopolitical tools if they are going to work or not, because the outcome is very, very hard to predict. I think it's better to try this rather than to keep offering statements that doesn't really say anything. So I would say that it would definitely be an option to try. Yes.
I guess it also opens the questions of how strict sanctions should we be willing to do. Like what strict international tools should European powers be willing to use? But that's not a question from the Christopher. No, Thomas. Sorry.
Yeah, but in that sense, I think there's also on sanctions there's a discussion right now because of the U.S. Want to make sanctions in Hong Kong if this goes through, where people are saying, okay, but who will pay the price? It will be the people of Hong Kong. But I think that in this case, that's what we need to do, unfortunately. And it's not easy, but that's the only way to go, because maybe these sanctions won't stop China from doing what they're doing right now, but it will maybe teach them a lesson to the future, and I think that could be effective.
There is one question here about these actions like we saw with the 5G network, but I think we've touched upon this now on how a combination of different actions from the European unions is probably what several here would agree with, just depending on how far they would go. I would instead go. I would like to ask. So there's a question here about how can you spread the word in Europe? What's the best way forward? This is always a difficult question, right? How do you mobilize for this in Europe? So that's one question. But I also wanted to ask Dorian, like, what do Hong Kong want from Europe? What would they like to see from Europe?
I think for people in Hong Kong, right now it's a very difficult time because, as I said, it seems that channels for them to express their opinion are like closing. So they really need, we really need the international community to speak up, to voice out why this is wrong, and to realize that this doesn't just affect Hong Kongers. It has wider implications from Amnesty's point of view, from Amnesty International's point of view. It has a wider implication on people working and living in Hong Kong, and most importantly, the human rights narrative of there's this danger, especially if we look at how China has been expanding the national security framework in mainland China, that the idea of restricting rights to protect national security has been building and building and building, and there has not been enough challenge to this concept. There has not been enough challenge to this seemingly never-ending restrictions, just because we want to make sure that our country is safe. I mean, when we actually look at international human rights framework, there are some guidelines on these restrictions, but it seems that there isn't enough talk about it, and also there isn't enough voices to publicly to tell the Chinese government that this is a really big crackdown on the rights and freedoms of people in Hong Kong, and actually to international human rights framework in general.
Ola?
Yes, I think it's also, as Jordan said, I think it's very important to keep these topics on the agenda. I think this interparliamentary group is a very good way of doing that, because that will spread awareness of this in a lot of countries. And I think it will also, if you keep talking on these issues from our side, from our organization, we, last week, we put forward this proposal to change a square, the name of a square in Gothenburg, to Gui Minhai's Square. Gui Minhai is this Yale writer in China. He used to live in Gothenburg for a few years when he was at the Gothenburg University, and then he went to Hong Kong and opened up Causeway bookstores. And then he was kidnapped when he was on a vacation in Thailand. So we have been really trying to push this this narrative that what China does is also affecting us, and in this way we also kidnapped a Swedish citizen. So in Sweden it has started to become really uncomfortable for those politicians who isn't speaking up against China. So therefore, I think that was a reason, for instance, why there was a majority in the parliament for actually being pro-sanctioning China in the European Council. So I think it's very important to keep it on the agenda. I think both in Denmark and Sweden, we have been talking about Denmark for quite a lot, and that actually shows in politics. So yeah, find ways of talking about China. In our way, we're trying to be a bit creative as well.
There's a question here also about the free trade agreement negotiations that Norway is currently having with China. This has actually been a debate today in Norwegian news. Could you just give us a rundown of the arguments in that discussion, Christopher?
Sure. So Norway and China have been negotiating for a free trade agreement for many, many years. It was close to they were close to signing it actually in 2010 when Liu Xiaobo was given the Peace Prize, and it was put into the icebox, so the freezer, together with the bilateral relationship in general. And the negotiations started again after Norway caved in and signed a peace deal with China in 2016 in December. So now they've had, I think, 16 rounds of negotiations. It's taking longer than they expected, and the corona situation has made it even more difficult. What's happened now recently is that this weekend the Green Party of Norway decided to demand that any negotiations for a free trade agreement must include strong human rights elements and also labor rights. And in addition to this, we learned recently that the leader of the Liberal Party, the Venstre Party, one of the three parties in government, has also recommended that Norway pull out of the negotiations and put them on pause, which is especially interesting because it's the same party that currently has the minister responsible for the negotiations. So she's been put in a bit of an interesting situation right now. I don't think they're going to postpone or delay them, but there's a clear tendency that the tide is shifting also in Norway, and that there are more voices now willing to say that we may be a small country, but this is one of the weapons that we might have in our arsenal. And I also think that there was a mention earlier about the sale of Norwegian salmon to China during that period after the Peace Prize. And it's actually a myth that Norway suffered financially from that. Exports to China went way up. They more than doubled over the course of 6 years. It's a clear example that China buys whatever they want to buy, and that there is a space for negotiating and for pushing back, even though Norway chose not to do so in this instance. But we'll see now. I think it's interesting to see that now two parties, tiny parties, but still two parties are thinking about maybe not signing this trade agreement, and it has to go through Parliament. So there's who knows what might happen.
I guess this goes back again into the trade-off with politics and economics. Thomas, before we spoke, you mentioned that you weren't too happy with the free trade agreement that Denmark has, and this is the same issue with the investments that China has been made across Europe.
Yeah, we have seen in Denmark how these things work, because and it's all have a similar way of going. That, for example, we had this film festival, Copenhagen Docs, in Denmark, where the Chinese embassy approached the festival to tell them that if they were to show a China-critical movie, it could have big implications on the Danish and Chinese trade relationships. And we have seen this also in other examples. And I think that the problem is that, for example, in Norway, they talk about free trade with China. There is no such thing as free trade with China, because when you trade with China, you don't get freedom back. You get the opposite back. More Chinese interest in your country that propounds your freedom. So I think that in Norway they could learn a great deal on looking on Denmark. I actually think that of course you can trade with China and also be critical to China. Look at Australia, for example, who is one of the countries that is most critical to China, and also one of the countries that is most trading with China. But you need to be very, very clear in your own parliament and in your own government before you start trading with China, where you put the red lines. And I think that if they do the same mistake in Norway as we did in Denmark, just to say, okay, we will trade with China, whatever they want, we will make sure that we will never get in trouble with them. You sell your own freedom in advantage of getting to sell pork, for example, as we do.
So there's this huge theory, right, that international trade makes war really costly, because it costs you so much to lose all of that trade, and the whole economic system will be rigged towards professionalism, specialization. So so trade can be a bulwark against the global war. And when we're talking about this geopolitical changes, war is a possible endgame of geopolitical instability, right? So does any of you is there any voices here that would say, no, it sucks, but we have to have a free trade agreement with China? I guess that's a no. All right. Sorry. I think we had a good discussion here. I wanted to give everyone a chance to give some closing remarks. Maybe if you don't know what to say, then maybe say something about what you think is the way forward for this situation now. Let's start with the same procedure that we had when we started. So we'll go with Dorian first, and then Christopher, and then Thomas, and then Ola.
Thank you. I think it's right now the situation is I would say not very good, and I would say for the international community, from Amnesty International's perspective, it's important that the government the second governments keep reminding China that this law is extremely problematic in terms of protecting the human rights and freedoms of people in Hong Kong. And also, I think it's also important for us to keep having these conversations, because I think for a lot of people, especially for people in Hong Kong, or for a lot of people actually, the discussion of national security is rather new in terms of what it means to our daily lives. So I think it's important to really keep telling the stories, what we have seen in China when the law is implemented there. Why is it problematic? How does it affect our lives? We need to keep these conversations going, and different people are working at different levels. For example, to our colleagues, our friends, and also second governments, and also right now at the UN level, for example, at Human Rights Council, there are also a lot of people doing a lot of lobbying and using different space to raise these concerns to China, because right now in Hong Kong it's very difficult for people of Hong Kong to raise these concerns, to show their opinion publicly, and that's why it's important for the international community to amplify their voices.
Christopher?
Yeah, just a sort of final remarks. I think one of the main reasons why we should pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong, it's obviously for solidaric reasons. We are looking at a country that in many ways resembles the countries that we come from. It's a very advanced economy with a thriving culture, fantastic food, and to see how easy it is to lose the freedoms and the sense of democracy that Hong Kong has taken for granted, we should obviously care. And also because we see how quickly it erodes. We have to pay attention to how Hong Kongers and Taiwanese are reacting to the threat of a more assertive, more authoritarian China, because if anyone understands what it means, it is the population in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And we are fooling ourselves if we think that this isn't going to affect the rest of the world in any way. We heard an example there from a film festival in Denmark. Just in the past couple of days, we've seen the American company Zoom, who've gained some prominence over the past couple of months and become very popular as a way to have video conferences. They closed down the accounts of several pro-democracy groups talking about the June 4th massacre in Beijing in 1989 because they had a Zoom conference on that topic. Their accounts were closed down. American company closed down because they were in breach of what the government in Beijing feels is appropriate to talk about. These are universal values. We've all grown up in a society where we take this for granted. We're moving now into a territory geopolitically where we no longer can take that for granted. And I think the canary in the coal mine right now is Hong Kong. So we need to pay attention to that. As journalists, we most certainly will do so.
Thomas?
Thank you. Agree very much with what Christopher just said. So I think I will make it short. There can be no doubt about how we would like to see Hong Kong in the future as a democratic place. But the big threat now is China, and I see that for China, it's a big advantage to get more control over Hong Kong. So I will end where I started, saying that this is a game of advantage and disadvantage. So what we need to do is put more and more eggs into the baskets of disadvantage, so the disadvantages will get even higher. So it's very, very simple, I think, but even it's very simple in saying, but very, very hard in doing. But the biggest best thing we can do is to use our economy force, because China is a country that really knows the power of economy. And if we turn that weapon against China, I think we'll find it very, very useful. And I think that Hong Kong will find it as a weapon that can help their future to emerge in a democratic way and not in an authoritarian way as it's going right now.
Ole.
Yes, and as the speaker just said before, I mean, this is a no-brainer. This is it's obvious why we had to stand with Hong Kong in these times. For me, it got very personal when I was in Hong Kong, and you really realize that this is, especially the young generation, they have had access to internet, they have traveled abroad, they have met so many people from abroad while living in Hong Kong, and then they are supposed to be forced into these Chinese systems. It's just surreal, actually. So it would really feel like a betrayal from the rest of the world if we would let that happen, and if China would actually engulf Hong Kong and suppress the people. I do really hope that the EU and the rest of the world will actually take action on this matter. Otherwise, we will have actually betrayed the Hong Kongers. I know that on Thursday and Friday, it will be a debate in the European Parliament on Hong Kong, so that might be actually interesting to follow. There is a few drafts that have been put forward from the different groups, and they will definitely condemn the actions taken of China. And it will be interesting to actually see what kind of measures that the EU would also. This is European Parliament, of course, but it would actually be interesting to see what they have in mind. I know that the Renew Europe is talking about sanctions and also some kind of asylum regime. So if that would actually be in place, that would be very, very important for Hong Kong. And I think it would be important for the European Union as well to refresh this image that we could actually gather behind the issue. That would be very important.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think these are topics that will be discussed more in the next decades, to be honest. And at this point, you would all have gotten flowers or some chocolate or something like that, but the times does not allow it. But I know that Jessica, you wanted to say a few words before we end. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all our speakers for the fruitful and interesting discussion today. And thank you, Håkon, for moderating the whole session. Tomorrow will mark the first anniversary of the successful attempt to stall the passing of the extradition bill in Hong Kong. When on 12th of June 2019, protesters surrounded the Legislative Council in Hong Kong and managed to stop the hearing of the extradition bill, which was later being suspended and withdrawn. Yet this minor success has come at a great cost. Peaceful protesters and as well as journalists at a legal gathering approved by the police were catcalled and met with excessive force, tear gas and bullets. And ever since, this unrest and crisis in Hong Kong has only gone worse. We shall continue with our fight for freedom and democracy. In this modern globalized world, everyone is connected. What's happening in different sites will affect one another. So let us take action and to safeguard the freedom and democracy that we all cherish. Tomorrow may be too late. Thank you very much for your attention for the webinar. And the whole video will be put onto YouTube in our channel. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.